Boston Harbor, December 16th, 1773. In less than 3 hours, 342 chests of tea disappeared beneath the freezing water. What looked like a protest against taxes would soon become one of the defining moments in modern history. Britain's response pushed its American colonies closer to revolution, and within just a few years, a war for independence had begun. It is astonishing that one of history's greatest political turning points was sparked by something as ordinary as tea. How did a simple leaf become powerful enough to challenge an empire? The answer begins thousands of miles away from Boston, in the mist-covered mountains of ancient China. Long before tea crossed oceans on merchant ships, before it filled the cups of kings and merchants, and before governments taxed every chest that entered their ports, it was nothing more than a wild plant, growing quietly in remote forests. No one could have imagined that these small green leaves would one day connect continents, create immense fortunes, inspire philosophy, reshape international trade, and influence the rise and fall of empires. According to Chinese tradition, the story began nearly 5,000 years ago with a legendary ruler known as Shen Nong, the divine farmer. Ancient texts describe him as a wise emperor who traveled across his land, studying plants, teaching agriculture, and testing hundreds of herbs to understand their effects on the human body. Because many of those plants were poisonous, he is said to have suffered countless illnesses in his search for knowledge. Then, during one journey, while water was boiling beneath the branches of a wild tree, several leaves drifted into the pot. Curious, Shenong tasted the fragrant drink and immediately noticed its refreshing effect. Whether this moment happened exactly as the legend describes can never be proven, but for centuries, it has remained the symbolic beginning of tea's remarkable journey. At first, tea was valued not as a daily drink, but as a medicinal plant, believed to restore energy, improve concentration, and cleanse the body. Few people could have imagined that this quiet discovery would eventually reshape economies, fuel dangerous trade routes, ignite revolutions, and become part of the daily lives of billions of people around the world. The journey of tea had only just begun, and its greatest impact on human history still lay far ahead. For centuries, tea was never meant to be an everyday drink. In ancient China, it was valued as a medicinal herb. Physicians believed it could sharpen the mind, aid digestion, reduce fatigue, and cleanse the body. Whether every claim was true is still debated today. But one thing is certain: tea slowly earned a reputation unlike any other plant of its time. As generations passed, tea spread beyond mountain villages and into the courts of emperors. What had once been gathered from wild forests was now carefully cultivated in small gardens. The finest leaves were reserved for the imperial family, while skilled farmers learned that the taste of tea could change depending on the season, the soil, and even the altitude of the mountains where it grew. Tea was no longer simply a plant. It was becoming a symbol of refinement, discipline, and status. By the Tang dynasty, beginning in the 7th century, tea had become woven into daily life across much of China. Bustling markets sold dried leaves, alongside silk, spices, and porcelain. Inns served hot tea to exhausted travelers crossing long distances. Buddhist monks drank it during long hours of meditation, believing it helped them remain awake and focused. Scholars gathered over steaming cups to discuss poetry, philosophy, and politics. Tea was quietly shaping a culture that would endure for centuries. Then, around the year 760, a scholar named Lu Yu transformed tea forever. His book, The Classic of Tea, was far more than a guide to brewing. It described where the finest tea should be grown, how it should be harvested, prepared, and appreciated. For the first time, tea was elevated from a simple beverage into an art form. Across China, tea houses flourished, ceremonies became more sophisticated, and drinking tea evolved into an expression of education, respect, and harmony with nature. Yet while China perfected the art of tea, the rest of the world knew almost nothing about it. Beyond the mountains, deserts, and borders of the empire lay vast civilizations that had never tasted a single leaf. That would soon change. Merchants were preparing to carry tea farther than anyone had ever imagined, beginning a journey that would connect continents and eventually change the course of world history. For nearly 1,000 years, tea remained one of China's greatest secrets. It was cultivated with extraordinary care, celebrated by emperors, monks, poets, and scholars, yet almost unknown beyond Asia. While Europe searched desperately for exotic spices, precious silk, and fine porcelain, few had ever heard of the small green leaf that had already transformed Chinese civilization. Everything began to change in the early 16th century. Portuguese merchants and missionaries became some of the first Europeans to witness the remarkable tea culture of China. They watched noble families welcome guests with elegant tea ceremonies. They saw monks drinking tea before hours of silent meditation. They noticed merchants discussing business over steaming cups instead of wine. To many Europeans, tea seemed both mysterious and fascinating. At first, only tiny quantities reached Europe. The long voyage across oceans made tea incredibly rare and astonishingly expensive. Every chest had to survive thousands of miles of dangerous seas, pirates, violent storms, and unfamiliar ports before reaching European markets. By the time the first shipments arrived, tea had become a luxury that only kings, queens, wealthy merchants, and aristocrats could afford. Soon, Dutch trading ships began carrying larger quantities of tea from Asia. Amsterdam became one of Europe's earliest centers of the tea trade, where merchants auctioned precious tea leaves alongside silk, porcelain, and spices. What had once been a medicinal herb hidden in the mountains of China was rapidly becoming one of the most desirable commodities in Europe. Yet tea was still more than just an expensive drink. Many Europeans believed it possessed extraordinary healing powers. Doctors recommended it for headaches, digestive problems, and fatigue. Noble families proudly served tea to guests as a symbol of sophistication, wealth, and modern taste. Across Europe, curiosity continued to grow. No one realized that this growing obsession would soon attract the attention of the most powerful trading company in history. Before long, tea would become the foundation of an empire, fuel global trade, reshape economies, and ignite conflicts that would change the world forever. By the late 17th century, one company had begun to dominate the world's tea trade. The British East India Company was far more than a merchant business. It possessed its own army, its own navy, and enough political influence to shape the destiny of entire nations. Tea was no longer simply a luxury. It had become one of the most valuable commodities in the British Empire. As demand exploded across Britain, millions of pounds of tea arrived each year aboard East India Company ships. London docks overflowed with wooden tea chests, unloaded from distant voyages that had crossed the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Warehouses stretched for blocks, guarded day and night, because a single shipment of tea could be worth a fortune. Tea quickly became part of everyday British life. Wealthy families gathered each afternoon around elegant porcelain tea sets, while coffee houses and tea houses welcomed merchants, politicians, writers, and philosophers. Before long, tea was no longer reserved for the aristocracy. Improved trade and growing imports gradually made it accessible to the expanding middle class. Across Britain, drinking tea evolved from a symbol of luxury into a daily ritual shared by millions. Yet behind every cup lay a growing problem. Britain wanted ever greater quantities of Chinese tea, but China had little interest in British manufactured goods. Instead, Chinese merchants demanded payment in silver. Year after year, enormous amounts of precious silver flowed out of Britain and into China, creating one of the greatest trade imbalances of the 18th century. For officials in London and executives of the East India Company, the situation was becoming unsustainable. They needed a product that China would buy in return. The search for that solution would lead to one of the most controversial decisions in the history of global trade, one that would eventually push two great empires toward conflict. The solution Britain finally chose was not silver, it was opium. In the late 18th century, the British East India Company dramatically expanded opium cultivation across Bengal in India, then under British control. Vast fields of poppies replaced food crops, as thousands of farmers were forced into contracts that required them to grow opium for the company. The harvested sap was processed into dense black cakes, sealed inside wooden chests, and prepared for one of the most profitable and destructive trading networks in history. Officially, importing opium into China was illegal. The Qing government understood its dangers long before much of the world did. Addiction spread rapidly, weakened families, drained wealth, and threatened the stability of the empire. Yet enormous profits tempted foreign merchants to ignore the law. Smugglers met Chinese middlemen along the southern coast, under the cover of darkness, transferring opium onto smaller boats that carried the drug deep into the country. The strategy worked exactly as Britain had hoped. Silver that had flowed from Britain to China for decades now began moving in the opposite direction. Chinese merchants paid silver for opium, and that same silver was then used by British traders to purchase tea, silk, and porcelain. For the East India Company, the trade imbalance had finally been solved, but for China, the cost would prove catastrophic. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese citizens had become addicted to opium. Government officials watched with growing alarm as corruption spread through ports, military garrisons, and local administrations. Soldiers neglected their duties. Families sold their possessions to feed addiction. Entire communities fell into poverty, while foreign merchants continued growing richer. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor appointed an honest and determined official named Lin Zexu to end the crisis. Arriving in Canton, Lin ordered the arrest of Chinese opium dealers, closed foreign warehouses, and demanded that every chest of opium be surrendered. More than 20,000 chests were confiscated and publicly destroyed near Human in one of the largest anti-drug operations in history. For Britain, the destruction of such valuable cargo was unacceptable. What China considered an act of national self-defense, Britain viewed as an attack on trade and property. Diplomacy collapsed. Warships were dispatched toward the Chinese coast. Within months, the First Opium War had begun, forever changing the balance of power between East and West. The conflict was never simply about opium. It was about trade, wealth, imperial ambition, and the price nations were willing to pay to control one of the world's most desired commodities, tea.